Assalamu alaikum. Hello and a good day, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the online launch of the Pakistan Freedom of Expression report. I hope आप सबको मेरी आवाज़ आ रही हो. मेरा नाम वकास नईम है and I'm a program manager at Media Matters for Democracy. I welcome all the attendees who are joining us today over Zoom and over Facebook. Just a request at the beginning. I'm aware that a lot of our attendees are joining us from Pakistan, but also from abroad. So we'll try our best to remain bilingual during this conversation, speaking in English and Urdu, so that most of our guests and participants can tune in to the conversation and make use of it. Thank you for joining us today, like I said, for the online launch of the Pakistan Freedom of Expression report. This report has been prepared under the Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression initiative with support from the European Union. And we'll hear more details about this initiative shortly. Before we formally begin, some of you might be familiar with Media Matters for Democracy and our work, but I'll briefly introduce what we do. We are a nonprofit organization based in Pakistan, and we work mostly on issues related to freedom of expression, digital rights, and media and information literacy, including efforts to tackle digital disinformation. Our activities include research and the provision of various forms of supports to journalists, including through training opportunities. आप में से जो लोग पाकिस्तान में सहाफ़ी बरादरी से आपका ताल्लुक है, आप लोगों को अंदाज़ा होगा कि हम पिछले कुछ सालों से पाकिस्तान में सहाफ़ियों के साथ बड़े पैमाने पर काम कर रहे हैं, जिसके अंदर बहुत सारी ट्रेनिंग अपॉर्चुनिटीज़, बहुत सारी गाइड बुक्स और इसके अलावा दीगर किस्म की सपोर्ट जो है वो भी शामिल है. I'll now take a moment to briefly introduce the distinguished guests who have joined us today for this discussion and the report launch. Firstly, we are grateful to have among us Her Excellency Androulla Kaminara, the Ambassador of the European Union to Pakistan. I believe she'll appear on your screens shortly. We welcome you, Madam Ambassador, if you can hear us. We're also delighted to have here today some of the leading voices of press freedom and digital rights activism in Pakistan, who will be joining us for the panel discussion in a little while. We'll be joined by Ms. Fariha Aziz and Mr. Awais Aslam Ali, who are both prominent and vocal activists when it comes to press freedom and digital rights in Pakistan. I'll introduce them in detail when they're here. But right now, you might be able to see Mr. Asad Hashim on your screens, who is an incredibly talented independent journalist working in Pakistan. And was also the 2018 recipient of the AFP's Kate Webb Award, which honors the work of journalists working from risky and perilous situations. I've mentioned already that this report was prepared under the Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression initiative, which is a joint project being led by a civil society organization, the Center for Peace and Development Initiatives in Pakistan, and the Pakistan Press Foundation. From the Center for Peace and Development Initiatives, we are joined by Mr. Jalil Babar. Welcome, sir. He's managing this initiative overall. And last but not the least, we also welcome Sadaf Khan, who's the co-founder and director of programs of Media Matters for Democracy, and a media development professional with nearly 2 decades of experience. Sadaf, I'll now request you to formally introduce this initiative, the Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression initiative, and to our guests and attendees who might not have heard of this before. And then I'll also request you subsequently to invite the Honorable Ambassador for her keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vikas, and thank you everybody who is joining us in this webinar launch and who are joining us online on our Facebook Live. We are really delighted to have you here, and we are specifically delighted that you could join us at this important launch. We have been working on this report for a long while, and while it presents a very grim picture, which Vikas will share with you shortly, we are happy that we were able to document the developments that we have documented in this research. The research is obviously supported, as Vikas mentioned, under the Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression Initiative, or SEAM, as we call it. SEAM is a multi-year project that's being implemented across Pakistan with support from the European Union under its European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights, the EIDHR program. The project is led by Center for Peace and Development Initiative, CPDI, with partner organizations including us, Media Matters for Democracy, and the Pakistan Press Foundation, PPF, that's led by Uwais Aslam Ali, who will be joining us shortly. The SEAM initiative aims to contribute to enhance protection and promotion of the rights of freedom of expression and access to information in Pakistan, which are fundamental rights under Article 19 and 19A of the Constitution. In connection with these rights, the project also aims to increase the availability of knowledge about policy trends and raise awareness about policy gaps and practical challenges that limit the public's effective use of these rights. SEAM also intends to build the capacity of civil society stakeholders to be responsive to violations and develop support networks that can respond to these violations. Over the past year, the initiative has produced and published several research reports, policy papers, and the project partners are currently following up on these with capacity building interventions with journalists and human rights defenders. With that short introduction to the project, I would now like to introduce again the ambassador to EU, Ms. Androulla Kaminara. Ms. Kaminara took up her duties as an ambassador and the head of the delegation of the European Union to Pakistan in September 2019. So I guess most of her tenure has been spent during these surreal COVID-related times. We are very happy to have you here. She has served at various capacities at the European Commission, and she was also the European Union Fellow at European Studies Center at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University from 2012 to 2013. With that, I will invite Madam Ambassador to please deliver the keynote address. Thank you so much for joining us for this launch.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, dear colleagues, honorable guests, for joining us today. I want to start by thanking the organizations that contributed to the report, CPDI, Media Matters for Democracy, and the Pakistan Press Foundation for this timely and pertinent report. And I also would like to thank the colleagues from EU delegations and other delegations, as well as the UN, that have joined us today. Without freedom of expression and freedom of the media, an informed, active, and engaged citizenship cannot exist. This is a core principle of EU human rights guidelines for freedom of expression online and offline. In fact, these guidelines were adopted in 2014, and basically they address 6 different interrelated topics. One is combating violence and threats against the press, promoting laws and practices that protect the freedom of expression, promoting media freedom and pluralism, promoting and respecting human rights in cyberspace and ICT, very, very important, since the whole context within which freedom of expression and journalism takes place has totally changed. Promoting best practices by companies, because they're also very much involved in this. And finally, promoting legal amendments and practices to strengthen data protection and privacy. Now, the freedom of expression and the role of the media as platforms for expression represent one of the most important pillars of democracy, and this is at the heart of EU democracy support. Our engagement with this work is actually a firm indication of our commitments to advancing and supporting media freedom and freedom of expression at home and abroad. Of course, the freedom of expression is enshrined in the Chapter of Fundamental Rights, and it includes the right to This right also includes freedom to hold opinions and receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. So basically, freedom of expression and access to information are two sides of the same coin, and together they are key pillars of the functioning democracy. Access to information for citizens and journalists from government entities is an essential right and necessary to enhance the accountability and the executive towards this, of the executive towards the citizens. It also creates an important incentive for government officials to perform well, to fulfill their mandate to work for the development and prosperity of the country. Sorry about that. Just a minute.
Yes, please take your time. It's okay.
Please take your time, yeah.
Unfortunately, I was just eating something and I think it went the wrong way, so excuse me for that. And we can currently observe tendencies worldwide that indicate that freedom of expression is under attack through censorship and economic threats. Here we have to say that globally, because of COVID, we have seen freedom of expression really being limited. The other aspect is the issue of fake news and disinformation. And the use of disinformation for spreading of attacks against individuals, and also using fake news to promote narratives that are not true. I have to underline here that not everything that is written by journalists is also unbiased and ethical. So it's not only do we need to improve how governments and other institutions look at journalism, but also journalists have to improve the way that they self-censor, and they make sure that the profession is actually meeting the objectives that have been set for it, and meeting the standards that should be addressed. I read the Freedom of Expression report with great interest, and I'm really impressed by the analysis they give. I'm a great believer that if you want to address and to solve any problem, then you have to have data. You have to have data of specific numbers of how big is the problem, but also to be able to analyze trends. So just having a number on its own it's interesting, but it cannot be used for policy because you don't know if the trend is going up or down. Having such data is vitally important to address what the particular area needs. And I also noted that, unfortunately, Pakistan has only scored 30 out of 100 in the Freedom of Expression Index of 2020. And in fact, there has been a deterioration of the situation. This, of course, partly could be attributed to COVID-19 because there's a general global trend in that direction. But also I have to say that it cannot be just only to COVID outbreak. Of particular concern is the situation of journalists and the documentation of threats that they face, both online and offline. And I have seen a number of these harassment and cases against journalists. Also, unfortunately, this is something that we're seeing, that is a trend that we're seeing again globally, but it's also happening here, which is basically attacking more female journalists. The other important figures that I saw, which is quite an alarming figure, is that almost 1,980,000 websites were blocked in 2020. Some of that blocking could potentially be justifiable because it could be that they were spreading wrong news or fake news that could be putting people's lives in danger, let's say spreading wrong information on COVID, but a considerable amount of that blocking can be attributed to other let's say incentives, and that is very, very worrying. Just a final couple of words. We, the European Union and Pakistan, have signed a strategic engagement plan. This was done in 2019. Basically, this is a roadmap of common objectives between the EU and Pakistan. Part of it is a whole section of that roadmap that deals with democracy, governance, rule of law, and human rights. And freedom of expression is part of that. So this is part also of the commonly agreed areas of discussion between Pakistan and the EU. I would recommend to all to read the recommendations, and we will also reread the report very, very closely and take on board recommendations that it's making in order for us to adjust our policies and adjust our narrative and discussions with Pakistan on this issue. I would leave it at that. I would just like to say I look forward to the presentation and listening to the debate that will take place after this. And I would like to thank again both those that contributed to putting this report together, both the authors and also both the people that contributed with data that has produced such a really, really valuable report for us, and something that would shape our policies in the future. बहुत शुक्रिया.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. आपका भी बहुत शुक्रिया for your remarks today. I'll quickly move to the presentation of the main findings of the report. Just allow me to please share my screen with you all. All right, so I hope that you're now able to see my screen. I'll try to keep it brief. The presentation outline that I'll follow, I'll briefly introduce the assessment framework that we followed to produce this report, the methodology that was used to collect the data, some of which was highlighted by Madam Ambassador. And then I'll briefly comment on the scores, the dimension scores, and the final index score that we were able to calculate for this evaluation. As you all already know, the last year was completely dominated, overwhelmed by the COVID-19 pandemic, and we felt it was necessary to comment on the impact that COVID-19 might have had on the freedom of expression landscape in Pakistan. So I have a brief comment on that, and then I'll follow up with some recommendations before we move on to the panel discussion. So the assessment framework that we followed to produce this report was also developed during this same Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression initiative that we've talked about last spring. And it basically follows 6 dimensions, or it uses these 6 dimensions to kind of capture the situation of freedom of expression. And these are the legal environment, which includes indicators about constitutional guarantees, the laws and provisions and regulations that are available in Pakistan about freedom of expression and access to information. It also measures the press freedom situation by looking at the challenges and the threats that are being faced by journalists. There's one dimension devoted to the digital expression of citizens and those who are using the internet in Pakistan. Then we have dimensions about the pluralism and socioeconomic and political situation. The pluralism dimension looks at media diversity, the diversity in information sources, whether the media information sources in Pakistan are being allowed to or are being as representative as possible. The socio-political situation looks at incidents of opinion crimes, so incidents related to or laws related to sedition or anti-blasphemy provisions, as well as the participation of Pakistani citizens through their expression, through their speech in political activity. And finally, we have one dimension that is devoted to threats to expression, which kind of does a statistical review of various threats and risks that might be faced by not just citizens, but also obviously human rights defenders and journalists in the line of their work and in connection with their expression online and offline. So overall, in these 6 dimensions, we had 60 indicators, 10 indicators for each dimension, which were weighted equally. I'll give you a brief example of these indicators. So for example, in the press freedom dimension, we had indicator number 4, which dealt with impunity in crimes against journalists. And this was operationalized through a question statement to check how frequently perpetrators of crimes against journalists are brought to justice in Pakistan. And the responses in this case were operationalized on a Likert scale, on a 5-point Likert scale, to determine that perceived frequency. In other cases, we had the indicators specified as statements. So for example, in the pluralism dimension, you might notice that we checked for linguistic diversity of information sources, if citizens have access to media in all local and national languages. And here it's again a Likert scale used to measure it, but on against a statement. And then yet another type of indicator, which in this case connects with threats to expression. The threats to expression dimension was our most populated, most complicated area of evaluation, where we had a number of sub-indicators. So for example, among physical threats, we looked at whether journalists had been kidnapped or had gone missing in Pakistan during the previous year. So we included the count of those reported instances. So this freedom of expression assessment framework, based on these indicators, the diverse indicators, also suggested a measure of scoring them, a way of scoring them. So each indicator was scored on a scale from 0 to 1, with a high score usually representing a positive development. So if an indicator would score close to 1, that would reflect a better performance for that indicator. The mean scores were scaled by 100 for ease of comprehension and display. And then so our final score, the index score, lies within the range of 0 to 100. And we categorized it to sort of, again, make it easier to understand. So if the score is between the range of 0 to 24, that represents a terrible state of freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. So आपको आपकी स्क्रीन पे जिस तरह नजर आ रहा होगा कि हमारे पास बहुत सारे इंडिकेटर्स थे जिनकी मदद से हमने आज़ादी इजहार राय की सिचुएशन को मेजर करने की कोशिश की, और फिर जो हमारे पास फाइनल स्कोर आया उसको हमने मुख्तलिफ कैटेगरीज जो है वो असाइन कर दी, जो कि नाक़िस से अच्छी कारकर्दगी जो है वो जाहिर करती है. The methodology that was suggested by the assessment framework, keeping in view the different nature of those indicators. So for some of the subjective qualitative indicators, a survey of experts was recommended, and it was also suggested that these experts be identified from different stakeholder groups, different fields of life, including media, the politics, the political arena, human rights advocacy, law, and academia. And for the more quantitative data required for the threats dimension, it was suggested that we should rely on existing threat monitoring databases developed by different non-profit organizations, different press freedom and digital rights organizations working in Pakistan. So we applied this approach, and we kept the reporting period, the calendar year, the past calendar year of 2020. For our survey of experts, we were able to connect with 36 individuals from different fields, as you can see on your screen. And for the desk research for threats data, we relied on databases compiled by Pakistan Press Foundation, Media Matters for Democracy, Freedom Network, as well as legal and cyber harassment cases being documented by organizations such as Bolo Bhi and Digital Rights Foundation. Wherever available, we also relied on government statistics. In fact, those were our sort of first go-to means of verification. But then also transparency reports from digital platforms where they applied for certain sub-indicators, as well as news reports for verification. We do understand that this methodology also provides a limitation for our research findings. So in the interest of transparency, we have made the data set publicly available so independent researchers can review it and identify any potential issues with it so we can resolve them in time for the next assessment. We're also hoping that the next time we are able to apply this assessment framework, we'd have better controls in place as well, more independent scrutiny of the data. So based on this data collection, I'm going to quickly share how the 6 different dimensions that we had identified scored. So our first dimension was the legal environment, and you can see here that in the report we kind of represented our final scores for the indicators in the form of a radar chart. So again, the high scores in this case represent a better performance, जहां पर आपको इस radar chart के अंदर एक बड़ी वैल्यू नजर आ रही है, वो एक अच्छी परफॉर्मेंस को उस इंडिकेटर की रिप्रेजेंट करती है, जहां पे वो कम नजर आ रही है वो एक बुरी परफॉर्मेंस जो है रिप्रेजेंट करती है. Some of the low scoring indicators in this case were about the perceived independence of the media and internet regulators and the licensing regime for media organizations. So these are particularly broadcast organizations in this case. Where we found good scores were about the constitutional protections provided for freedom of expression and access to information. So both these rights are enshrined in Pakistan's constitution. But later on, we'll see that when we talk about the practical provisions and the practical protections for these constitutional rights, there we found Pakistan to be lacking in its performance. The second dimension dealt with press freedom. Again, here, the perceived censorship of news media, the self-censorship of among journalists, and the perceived frequency of threats to journalists scored really low in the indicator matrix. And when it came to the frequency of legal actions against the media organizations and journalists and licensing requirements to practice journalism as a journalist, we found the scores to be relatively better, although they still fell within the range of poor protections. For digital expression, we had a number of low scoring indicators. One of them dealt with or described online self-censorship. So basically, whether citizens, whether internet users in Pakistan refrained from commenting on certain issues online because they feared some kind of persecution or digital attacks. Also, the fairness and transparency in terms of content restrictions applied by Pakistan's internet regulator, that also scored really low on the indicator matrix. In terms of sort of positive scores, we noticed that no website registration is required so far in Pakistan to start your own news and information portals. Also, our surveyed experts felt that the frequency of extrajudicial violence on the basis of online expression is still almost borders on the satisfactory in Pakistan. So it's a level where it's not alarming it wasn't alarming for many of the experts, although in recent days we've seen instances on Pakistani social media where people have been threatened because of their expression. So यहाँ पर digital expression में हमें जो content restrictions regulator यानी PTA की तरफ से लगाई जा रही थी उसके हवाले से खदशात जो हैं वो देखने को मिले. In the fourth dimension, which dealt with pluralism, the independence of the public sector media, those are the state-owned broadcasters, Pakistan Television and Radio Pakistan, it scored really low. The experts perceived these public sector entities to be completely within government or political control. And this was actually the lowest scoring indicator throughout the six dimensions. And also there were concerns about the media representation of gender and marginalized communities. Where the scoring was a little better was in terms of access to diverse media sources. Our experts believed that people in Pakistan had access to diverse media sources, which also allowed them to interact with diverse perspectives. In terms of socioeconomic and political situation, one positive was a really high score for the use of internet for mobilization and organization around social, political, and other causes. So it was, the internet is being seen as a platform that allows people to, exercise their right to freedom of association and assembly. In terms of the negative or indicators that scored really low, were, this fear that political speech online or offline will be targeted with attacks, violence, and maybe legal action. And also the ability of citizens to enjoy benefits of the internet, which were hampered by a poor internet infrastructure. So infrastructure constraints were seen as a major hurdle in people accessing the web effectively and efficiently in Pakistan. And finally, the most complicated dimension that we had was threats to expression, which on our final index was represented as a protection from threats. And there's a sort of technical reason for that. But before I get into that, the way we collected this data was that we measured these indicators and sub-indicators for year 2020. And then we also developed a baseline for the same indicators and sub-indicators for 2019, so we could compare them. And so each sub-indicator for 2020 was compared with its statistical value, its numerical value for 2019. And based on that comparison, we were able to determine if some of these numbers were going up. So for example, were there more people killed in Pakistan in connection with their expression, or more journalists jailed or arrested during 2020 compared with 2019? And that final score was then parsed through another formula to get a protection from threats dimension. And the reason for doing that was something I had mentioned earlier, that on our index, higher scores represent a better situation of freedom of expression. But when we talk about threats, as you can see in the radar chart here, a higher value basically shows more threats, and that is actually a poor situation for freedom of expression. So we had to convert this threats dimension into a protection from threats value, which came out to be 12 out of 100, and that's the lowest scoring dimension in our index. ये सारी जो हमारी 6 dimensions हैं और इनकी जो indicators की measurement थी, जो जैसे मैंने बताया कि एक online survey के जरिए कुछ हमने जो secondary data collection के जरिए जो data इकट्ठा किया, पाकिस्तान में मुख्तलिफ जो attacks और threats रही हैं सहाफ़ियों को, उसके हवाले से इन सब को इकट्ठा करके we were able to calculate an overall freedom of expression index score for Pakistan. And that cumulative mean score came out to be 30 points out of a total of 100. And as you can see on your screen, and the categories that I had listed earlier, this value lies in the range of poor protections for freedom of expression. I'm sure that you'll have a lot of questions based on what has been presented so far. So please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the chat feature available on your screens. We'll hopefully get to questions in a little bit. But like I mentioned before, we felt that was very important to talk about the COVID impact. And some of the major issues that we saw regarding COVID during the past year, its impact on expression was the effects of the digital divide, which came into play when education and other opportunities went online, and that access to information gap that opened up for many thousands of Pakistanis. Also, the risks and threats that were faced by journalists throughout the year, including restrictions on media access. We'll talk a little bit more about this in our panel discussion. And finally, disinformation and the associated politicization, which will also be discussed in detail during the following discussion. The recommendations, again, we have a number of recommendations in the report, and I'll request you to please go through them whenever you get the time. But some of the key recommendations are that we have demanded a legislation for journalist safety, which has been pending in Pakistan for many years. We would like the authorities and the legislators to review the cybercrime law, especially its content blocking clause that has been used to, again, impose content restrictions in the country on online content, obviously. As well as a review of the broadcasting code of conduct, which, again, many in the media industry believe is used as a censorship tool. Finally, there should be more judicial checks on law enforcement when it comes to cases related to online speech, and we have a recommendation about that as well. I'll stop here. I'm sure that some of you might have more questions about the findings. But we'll take those questions after the panel discussion, if it's all right with our participants, and we'll move to the panel discussion. I believe most of our participants have joined us. We have with us Asad Hashim, as I mentioned, he's a journalist working in Pakistan, and Mr. Mukhtar Ahmed Ali, Mr. Awais Aslam Ali, who is the Secretary General of the Pakistan Press Foundation, as well as the co-chair of the Media Freedom Coalition's Advisory Network. And we also welcome Ms. Fariha Aziz, as I mentioned earlier. Fariha is the co-founder of the digital rights advocacy organization Bolo Bhi, which has been on the forefront of digital rights advocacy in Pakistan for the past many years. We welcome you all. Asad, I'll begin with you. And my first question is about journalists and how they were affected during the pandemic. I remember last year we had concerns about their physical safety, their psychological safety, financial crises, but also these restrictions on access. Now we are in the third wave firmly in Pakistan. There's very little we are hearing about the COVID vaccine deployment. How do you think journalists have become, or have they become more vulnerable during the past year, please?
So I think, first of all, I think that's a very pertinent question, because it really speaks to some of the concerns of working journalists in this country. And I think they have been very vulnerable throughout the pandemic. As we discussed at World Press Freedom Day, the idea at that time was talking about how they were being treated as frontline workers, in so much as, they were not subjected to restrictions. They could go anywhere. They were expected to continue working, but there was very little protection for them in terms of PPE or in terms of offices taking care of their health and so on. And in that respect, I didn't see much of a change actually over time. I think what we have seen added to that list of concerns regarding their health is that now there's a much more increased risk of online attacks. That's both in terms of social media, but also in terms of being subjected to cybercrime cases that are being pursued by the FIA. And we've seen a large increase in those cases, particularly for those who criticize the government. I mean, the government itself, in the social media rules that it tried to pass earlier this year and then has amended them a little bit since then. But the original version of the social media rules actually tried to criminalize any online criticism of federal government or any government employees. Now, I mean, that, to my mind, makes the position of what the government is trying to set out as the atmosphere for journalism to be and expression to be pretty clear. I think on vaccine deployment, we're kind of just at the start of it right now, obviously. I think the problem so far for vaccine deployment in Pakistan has been more of a demand side problem. Many people have not really bought into the idea of the vaccine, and so therefore there's not enough demand for them. But I mean, I think as that momentum begins to pick up, you're going to see new problems crop up. You're going to probably see very likely pressure will be imposed on journalists not to report on any shortages, if there are any for that matter. You've already seen quite limited reporting and very limited information being put out by the government on procurement plans in terms of when are they getting them, when are they supposed to arrive, where are they coming from, and so on and so forth. And I think one other element of this that we need to really pay attention to is we're already beginning to see quite a lot of anecdotal evidence coming through of elites, whether political or otherwise, getting access to the vaccines ahead of their turn. So whether that's family members of federal ministers, or whether that's prominent celebrities, or whether that's just people who have a lot of elite privilege in this country. And I wonder if there will be, and I expect there probably would be, quite a lot of pressure on journalists not to report on such things in the future. I will give the government credit on one thing on the pandemic, where it should be given, is there were a lot of concerns going into this that the government would be not very transparent on data, or that it would try to hide information regarding the contours of how the epidemic is sort of unfolding in Pakistan. And to my mind, and it's not just a matter of getting the data from the government, but also interrogating that data and investigating it. To my mind, the government has done well on that front. They have, in fact, they've not been hiding deaths as a lot of us thought might be the case, and so on. So on that front, I'll give them some credit. But I think the threats to journalists very much are still there.
Thank you. Asad, I have a quick follow-up because you mentioned
Mhm.
that we saw an increase in digital attacks on journalists, and we obviously also noted with great concern the joint statements issued by women journalists last year, in which they identified coordinated attacks,
Mhm.
especially against women journalists reporting on the pandemic. Do you see
Mhm.
a link between the digital attacks and offline threats to journalists? So sort of physical safety risks that have always been there in Pakistan. Do you see this sort of anxiety among the journalistic community that some of this might translate into offline violence?
I think that is definitely there, and it was. And look, all forms of threats are definitely more real for women journalists in this country, because women are just a more vulnerable community out here. We have a fairly misogynist mindset among many people, and women have to deal with a number of threats that men just simply don't even have to think of. So there is definitely that dimension. I would also say, yeah, there's definitely a concern regarding whether whether these online threats can turn into offline threats. And I think that kind of relates to the kind of polarization we've begun to see in our society. And that's not just something that's happening in Pakistan. I think that's something that's happening worldwide, and it's encouraged by the political parties here, as it is encouraged by political parties in other countries. Essentially, what we've got now is I'll talk about the Pakistani case. In the Pakistani case, you've got a government that essentially says, look, here are the good journalists that say everything that we want them to say, and here are the bad journalists who sometimes criticize us and on other times might say good things as well, because they're covering things objectively. But because they criticize us, they're bad journalists. Now, once you're in the bad category, it's a very difficult place to be, not just in terms of the credibility that you lose because your audience actually believes that you have a nefarious purpose in mind when you don't, but also in terms of potential, as you say, offline attacks as well. Again, those things do tend to be more limited. I still do generally believe that. I don't think that the chances of a journalist being attacked for their political coverage is relatively lower. But if we're covering things related to the military, then definitely that threat goes up. If we're covering anything related to blasphemy, then the threat from the general public is huge, actually.
Thank you so much, Asad. And that's a really valid point that you've raised these attacks on the credibility of journalists, and not just journalists. I feel when it comes to human rights activists and defenders online as well, attacks on their credibility kind of also creates this ripple effect in which the way people perceive them might be affected, and that obviously affects the overall situation of freedom of expression. I'll take that point and come over to Fariha, and I'll basically want to ask you about the issues that we saw with respect to content regulation last year. Some of those have obviously they're persisting even to this day. So the government came up with these really regressive rules for content regulation under the cybercrime law. But at the same time, we noticed dozens of instances online where whether it was participants, organizers of the Aurat March, whether it was women journalists, or individuals who were raising voice about the Me Too movement, were repeatedly targeted and attacked. And it seemed that even though we had this content restrictions and content regulations being cooked up, we didn't see enough protections for them. So how do you see this sort of tension and dichotomy Where do you think this will lead us? Because now it's in court and the government has made some promises. What do you think about that? Please, if you could go ahead.
Thanks. So to begin with, I think 5 years now, it'll be 5 years since this year, since the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act was enacted, right? And at the time we said, look, this law is just going to be another tool and weapon in the hands of the state. And they can web all the narratives that they wanted about protecting citizens, etc. So we know that to be true now. Whether it's a content regulation function, whether it's criminalizing certain kinds of speech, including harassment, if you look at how this law has been used, the state is very quick to construct cases against dissidents and journalists and even women who are making allegations of sexual violence, for instance, right? But when women are targeted or minorities are targeted or various groups who are vulnerable are targeted online very openly, there's incitement. The law does not, the law is not implemented. And so again, I'm very cautious in saying that the law should come into effect by itself, or FIA should take action, or the state should act itself, because you have to make the distinction between what's a cognizable offense and what is not. And we see that in the case of journalists, even non-cognizable sections, there are FIRs registered. So we have to make that distinction, but it's very clear what the intent of this law was, and it was never to protect citizens, and least of all women. And so, of course, you ask the state to they have a responsibility towards citizens, but to fall a victim to these narratives of we need laws because there's no protection, it was false. And a lot of people, even within the media, were of the opinion at the time 5 years ago that yes, social media needs to be regulated. And look at where a lot of your mainstream anchors and journalists are today. They're on social media because those spaces have been constricted for them in the mainstream, where they had columns, where they had shows and all of that. Coming to the content regulation part of it, right now the rules, and this is under the Section 37. Now, Section 37 was also a very hotly contested section of the law. What it does is copy paste Article 19 of the Constitution, and it gives PTA, which is the telecom regulator, what I believe to be parliamentary and judicial functions have been outsourced to a telecom regulator, which has very little independence. There's very little oversight over them. And they have been tasked to interpret and apply these restrictions that are laid out in Article 19. Now, unlike Article 19A, which there is provincial legislation and federal legislation, and it's more in terms of protective that you may ask for information, and if there are exceptions, it's clearly listed in the law. No such thing exists for Article 19. And so the rules that have been enacted under Section 37 are basically the function was, and if you read the language of that particular section, it was to prescribe a procedure for safeguards and oversight over the PTA when they were to discharge these functions. However, we saw that the first iteration of the rules in February, then various other iterations have gone even beyond the Parent Act. And there are various petitions. There were petitions earlier also, then they changed the rules. They've changed the rules thrice, again, in a very non-consultative manner. The consultations have been token. My expectation would be, even from the court, is not to indulge further consultations. That's an executive process the government could have followed and should have followed prior to all of this, prior to this whole secretive, like this a draft being circulated online and we find out, oh, but it's actually been approved already, or the fact that they go ahead and make certain minor changes and then hold these consultations but actually don't take into account. So there was a February 2020 statement by civil society signed by over 100 individuals and organizations, and then a subsequent one, which said that we don't recognize this consultation process that the PTA undertook because we don't recognize the legitimacy of this, especially while the rules remain in effect. And the position of civil society organizations, especially digital rights groups, has been the repeal of Section 37. It has no business being in a criminal law, and these powers being delegated to the PTA, which in my view, Section 37 is unconstitutional. Now, to frame that challenge, that's also a question of a political environment. A political environment our courts are situated in as well, right? So in terms of the current consultation and now the AG letter and yet another committee, I think these are just stalling tactics. In my opinion, there is no value to these consultations. If any consultation is to take place, it has to be after the rules are withdrawn formally. They cease to be in effect. And the conversation has to be not just about the rules, but also the vires of Section 37 and just how a PICA has been put to effect and PTA powers have been exercised. And the court, I think, should really just rule on the vires of the rules. Why indulge the executive any further?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Faria. And I'll take one of the points that you raised, the manner in which some of this regulation was developed, the secret manner in which it was approved and passed, and then obviously the way in which the consultations were conducted, despite serious concerns about their legitimacy. And now, again, as you mentioned, we've had a recent order just yesterday, I believe, where a new consultative committee has been formed and tasked to perform some of those same or take some of those same measures again within a very short period. And this has been, it seems, not to be overcritical of the government, but this seems to be a pattern in the government's dealing with other issues related to expression as well. I'll use that as sort of a pivot to go over to Mr. Awais Aslam Ali and ask him about the journalist safety legislation, which we heard great things about a year or so ago. And it felt that this government might actually go ahead and pass this legislation about journalist safety. But then during the last year, we've seen that bill also get stalled. Sir, if you have any updates about the law and why do you think that's necessary, given the situation that we have for journalists and press freedom in Pakistan at the moment? So you'll have to unmute yourself, please.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, Waqas, so I thank you very much for inviting me. And the internet is not so good, so I will go by the written question that you have asked as to why do you think that the safety legislation is necessary and what are the passages for it. So first, the reason why we need safety legislation for journalists is that journalists are not killed because of any personal reason. If a journalist is killed for a personal reason, for any other reason, we do not want any special law, any special treatment for them. But when a journalist is killed for his profession, for writing something, for broadcasting something, or attacked, not just killed is the ultimate, but attacked, then the violence is perpetrated to stop the people from knowing. And that is a far greater goal, is to prevent people from knowing. And once, if people are scared because of violence, then of course you see that increase in self-censorship, things which are of basic importance to the people don't get to know about those things. So that is why safety legislation for journalists is essential. Secondly, we have seen that in the past 2 decades, media itself has become a prime target rather than just reporting on it. And so a lot which should have been reported upon is not being reported upon. And so, and of course, like you mentioned, there is over 90% impunity. So somebody who generally kills a journalist or attacks a journalist are people in power position, whether it is in the local feudal lord, whether it is some drug lord, whether it is intelligence agencies, whether they are non-state actors, whoever is attack the journalist is in a position of power, and it is very difficult to investigate those attacks independently, and that is why it is very important that a safety legislation be passed. And in Pakistan, safety legislation, the demand for safety legislation for journalists has been going on for a number of years. And up to now, till 2020, the drafts which were submitted were really terrible drafts. And those were drafts which were submitted, which sought to bring back all the black laws in the garb of a safety legislation. And so they were pretty much rejected by media stakeholders, including PFUJ, CPNE, APNS, human rights activists. Everybody had rejected those till the draft which was presented in 2020. Now, that was a surprising in that it was acceptable. There were weak points in it, but by and large, it was a serious effort by the government to bring about, to set up institutions that could actually make a difference. And that law was presented by the Ministry of Human Rights, and it was presented to the cabinet. And the hope and the prayers were that the cabinet would approve it and then present it to the assembly. But the cabinet only approved it in principle and then sent it to the Ministry of Information, and they asked them to harmonize if they had any comments. And this is where it has been lingering for a while. As you know, as a part of the EU-supported SIME project, PPF has been involved in lobbying for the implementation of it and for improving some of the mechanisms in the law. And if I have the time, very briefly, I will say that this law, which is there, depends on an independent commission to investigate crimes against media. And we have basically proposed two things in consultation with all stakeholders, is that this commission be strengthened and the methodology for appointing the commission chair be improved. And then we have set about trying to lobby for these changes and for early implementation. And in this connection, PPF held a meeting with the President of Pakistan last week. And again, he also called for an early implementation. And the situation which is there is that the Ministry of Information has now given its recommendations as to what changes are necessary. And then it has been sent to the law department to finalize the draft of it. That is one thing. The second point is that most of the safety issues that are done with the related to journalists deal with the police, and police is a provincial subject. So we have also been lobbying the provincial government to enact a similar law at the provincial level. And here, the government of Sindh has shown great interest, and they have said that they will put it on a fast track. And Bilawal Bhutto has given instructions that this should be. So we are hopeful that the law in Sindh would be passed, and we are hopeful that the law, the draft of the law from the federal government would come. What I fear is that law that at the federal level, the draft which will come may contain attempts to sneak the provisions of previous media laws into that. And there, I think the civil society and all stakeholders have to be vigilant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. And I absolutely agree that we'll need to be alert about whatever new form this draft might take. So, Sadaf, coming over to you, I mean, we've heard about some of the long-standing issues that we've raised voice about when it comes to press freedom. But last year, we saw a rather new kind of threat also affecting our free expression, and that was online disinformation. I'm aware that you focused on this digital disinformation and its flow in Pakistan over the last few months. How do you think that affects people's or the public's freedom of expression, especially online?
Yeah, thank you, Vikas. I think the online disinformation, even though we keep talking about it as an emerging threat, but if you look at the history, the disinformation and misinformation itself was categorized as a threat to human societies per se in 2016 by the World Economic Forum. So I think it's self-evident that disinformation does stand to have an impact not just on freedom of expression but actual physical safety of people and citizens. And we saw this threat kind of increasing during COVID, because the disinformation that we saw last year was directly connected to the pandemic. It was connected to the public health, and now we're seeing it rising. There's rising amounts of misinformation and disinformation around the vaccines. And obviously, living in a country where digital media information literacy is pretty low, and a large populace, a large segment of our populace cannot be expected to kind of deconstruct, verify, fact check themselves, and may fall for the disinformation that is being projected by various quarters. I think it's safe to say that disinformation itself has become a threat. Now, wherein the freedom of expression comes in, the difficulty is, and the direct impact that I see on FOE is how governments and states choose to deal with this misinformation and disinformation. During the last year in 2020, 17 countries in the world, including some European countries, introduced new laws that criminalize disinformation, or they introduce changes to their existing laws to bring in disinformation into their ambit, because the impact on public health that I was talking about was seen as a good way, as a good reason or an excuse to kind of strengthen to the laws that exist. Now the problem with that is, because specifically online, it's not just journalists, it's not just professionals who are sharing and disseminating information, but citizens themselves, and holding citizens to the same kind of criteria, to the same kind of scrutiny, and making them pass through the same kind of scrutiny that is generally reserved for people who make information their profession, is extremely problematic, and it's probably unfair. So, for example, most of the attendees, I'm sure, the maximum amount of disinformation they might have received regarding vaccine and COVID may have come through family WhatsApp groups, and the people who share them and spread them are usually elderly. They belong to a generation to whom digital does not come naturally. So there's that when it connects to the citizens, but then there is also who defines what misinformation is. In Pakistan, unfortunately, we have seen our government, a number of our ministers, go on TV and make really, really responsible statements regarding. So, for example, I remember right in the beginning of the first wave, there was a statement by Chief Minister and even by the Prime Minister himself that called the mask a fashion, wearing mask a fashion statement. And now on one end, responsible people responsible for management of the pandemic in the country are making statements like this. But on the other hand, let's say a journalist criticizes or raises question about the way the government has been managing the pandemic. Those questions can be criminalized and targeted as misinformation, which is something we have seen happening in Bangladesh, where cartoonists were targeted and arrested simply for making a cartoon around the COVID management strategy. So when it comes to legislating around misinformation and disinformation, it becomes a very slippery slope, because deciding what misinformation is and criminalizing it, specifically when you can't really know the sources, which created that disinformation, you don't really do anything to change the impact of it. It's a slippery slope both for freedom of expression and also for the right to information, because by just criminalizing and or by just kind of taking it away from public view in any way, you're not you're not managing the key impact. You're not making the public well enough, aware enough, skillful enough to kind of make those critical judgments by themselves. And so the impact extends from just FOE, and it goes into the realm of freedom, right to information as well, because the public is unable to make decisions about what the correct information is.
Thank you so much, Sadav. So I'd like to put one more question to all the panelists, and that's about the basically the series of suspensions and bans and advisories that we saw different media and internet regulators issue during the past year. So we had, for example, the ban on TikTok that turned out to be temporary earlier, but now again, TikTok has been banned in Pakistan. And then we saw similar issues with some entertainment TV shows being aired on primetime television networks, and then also concerns about whether a certain kind of commentary or analysis was allowed on our TV screens, on our news channels or not. And it seems there are certain values or certain trends that are kind of used as a justification whenever these restrictions are imposed. And sometimes these deal with our so-called socio-cultural values. What do you think about that? Do you feel when we go on social media, there seems to be a vocal majority that also favors restrictions on the basis of maybe standards of morality, but at the same time we see that sometimes this might be used as a tool to silence others. So I'd like to hear your take on that and how that affects the overall protections for freedom of expression in Pakistan. Fariha, if I may start with you, please. You
Thanks,
have to unmute.
Vikas.
Yes.
Yeah. So this is certainly a problem, right? The one, you have PTA and PEMRA, the way they're structured as regulators and the kinds of powers that have been given to them, whether through PICA or PEMRA's constituting law. And then there are complaints that are made to them. And we also see that beyond the regulators, there are courts. The Islamabad High Court overturned it, and then Peshawar High Court imposed it. And there are these petitioners who keep approaching the court saying, we've been outraged, or there's certain activities that are typically, they tend to take the plea that either they are against religion or they're against culture, or they say now, as we saw with TikTok, that it's to do with the youth and corrupting the youth, etc. So it's a very paternalistic also approach by the courts and also the regulators. I mean, there's no a distinction in terms of, so even where we've seen court orders, and to some extent we've seen that the Islamabad High Court has also spoken about, let's say, Article 19, but primarily what's happened is that the responses have been in terms of the violation of due process. We've not really gotten down to the content debate as yet, right? In courts or otherwise. And the other danger I see is that, look, we're quite clear on when PEMRA oversteps and PTA oversteps, and we think that platforms, a blanket suspension of platforms should not be done. But similarly, this page level filtering, etc. So we have filters that have been deployed as well, right? That's also a function that they should not be able to perform, deciding. Then there's the company moderation side of it, right? In terms of the law enforcement requests that are sent by governments and accepted, and then what is reported to them under their rules, because we've also seen that there has been a weaponization of these mechanisms as well, where en masse reporting has led to account suspensions. So that's another area that we're concerned with. But then at the same time, because you mentioned, certain a value system. Now, of course, we have a right wing which believes that, certain Western values, as they claim, are being imposed, and these platforms are doing that, and so we have to. But the other thing I also notice, even within so-called, and I don't like these labels of, liberal, progressive circles, etc., but even within these circles, when it's about somebody that we don't agree with, we don't like, I'm not talking about just when somebody is inciting violence. So let's take the example of the playwright Khalilur Rahman, who got a mainstream platform. Not what he's doing on the shows and how he is, but also in terms of the drama that he wrote, and there were petitions saying we're offended as women, or it's misogynist, etc. And so don't let the last episode air, or remove it from YouTube. And that was one of the petitions before the Sindh High Court. Now, these things are also I don't think that there should be a reliance on the same regulators to execute this function, because what you essentially end up doing is empowering already questionable powers and regulators, right? And this cultural and moral policing tends to happen. So I think it's very important that even within certain circles, there has to be this recognition, whether it comes to these regulators or PICA for that matter, when you choose to use a law or not to use a law, these powers, because at the end of the day, I mean, what function are they discharging? And I think what we need as a society, what never happens because we keep asking for this intervention, is evolution as a society to create robust mechanisms of cultural responses to certain content. So if something is misogynist, what is a better appropriate method to counter that, right? Rather than just this remove them, don't give them a panel, or don't let them air their drama, etc., right? Because there's still an audience. And what you do is that when you do remove somebody in this manner, whether it's on the left or the right, you instantly create them as a victim for a certain segment. And then there's a cashing in on the victimization as well, right? And so there's more popularity of that particular thing. This is what I argue in terms of a last comment, that banning is counterproductive, because you actually generate more traffic to things and more interest in things which people would not have found out about.
Absolutely. And especially given the nature of the internet, where you probably wouldn't be able to access a certain piece of content unless you're looking for it, or unless somebody in your close circle shares it. Sadaf, to the points raised by Fariha, I would also like to ask you whether we really need to rethink the broadcasting code of conduct that we have in place at the moment. I mean, this is now particularly regarding our entertainment TV channels. Do you think PEMRA has, for example, excessive control over what goes on air and what doesn't, and whether maybe a co-regulatory approach would benefit freedom of expression more?
Definitely, because I think what PEMRA has in the code, in the written code, that itself obviously is problematic. We every time you bring in words like morality and culture and etc., you are completely negating the diversity we have within Pakistan. You are being dependent. You are promoting dependence on subjective translation of whoever is sitting in the COC or on the PEMRA board or within the authority at that time. And obviously, I think more of a problem is what is probably not written in the code but goes on anyways. For example, the advisories we recently saw around NAB and criticism and what kind of approaches should be taken, etc. So I do feel that the way PEMRA's code has been defined and the way it has been implemented, it's not just it doesn't raise question for the independence of the regulator, but also it raises the question about whether the regulator and those who are the government, the information ministry, who is who controls the regulator in that way, they understand the main objective of having media regulators like that. But I will not absolve the media industry here as well, because while there is like a really, really regressive stand and very controlling approach that PEMRA and the regulators have taken, I don't think our industry also has responded to the needs of the hour. The only time I remember the industry coming together collectively to come up with something that was good was when we were seeing all that terrorism coverage back in 2006-7, when the Pakistan Broadcasters Association created a code of conduct regarding terrorism coverage that banned the broadcast of live images and graphic and gory images, etc. But the thing is that we don't need such code just for terrorism coverage. The lack of trust in media and the kind of the kind of critique, the kind of, almost I would say, anger that the public has towards media does have a lot to do with how the media has chosen to conduct itself in some ways. So when we are going towards when we talk about a co-regulatory approach, I think the regulator, obviously, massive reforms are needed, and the assurance of independence is needed. But there's also what Faria was talking about, an approach, an alternative approach that allows us to create the discourse within which non-legal, non-criminalizing ways can be used to target the narratives that are problematic, on not just on news but on let's say entertainment media as well. Why should there be a need to ban Khalilur Rahman Khamar if we were seeing enough alternatives, alternative narratives, progressive narratives being promoted on TV? And then if that has to happen, then obviously the public has to have a stake in the media. So I feel that overall, when it comes to code of conduct and when it comes to the question of regulation and co-regulation, we will need to see improvement from both sides. Obviously, I won't give the same kind of responsibility to the media and to the media workers themselves, because they have been consistently targeted through laws. They have faced physical attacks, etc., and whatnot. So they have their own serious challenges. They have financial challenges to deal with, whatnot. But the realization for adopting a more professional approach, I think, to make themselves credible and to make themselves acceptable in the eyes of public and in the eyes of their viewers, that commitment to professionalism and that commitment to diversity and inclusion, I think that is something that the media will have to focus on, while media and organizations like us focus on the changes that are required within the regulatory codes as well.
Thank you so much, Sadab. Vaisab, if you can hear me, I have one final question for you. And that is about the sort of overall situation of freedom of expression in Pakistan. As you might have noticed, our report tries to measure that quantitatively on an index, but obviously this is the first edition of this report, और हमें उम्मीद है कि अगले साल हम इससे compare कर पाएंगे. We'll be able to compare this performance. But you have been sort of monitoring press freedom and freedom of expression in Pakistan for many, many years. And we routinely hear now from journalists and from others that they are being forced to practice self-censorship, that they don't have enough space on TV media, वहाँ पर censorship है. तो इसके बारे में आपका क्या ख्याल है? क्या आपको लगता है कि अमूमी तौर पर सूरत हाल ज़्यादा ख़राब हो गई है पिछले कुछ सालों में when it comes to censorship and self-censorship? How do you see that, sir?
Okay, thank you, Waqas. It's been a good discussion, and I think one thing that is becoming clearer and clearer, that the basic problem or the basic weakness that lies in it stems from the constitutional provision of the Constitution. Now, Article 19 says that everyone shall have freedom of speech and expression, and subject to reasonable restrictions imposed by law in the interest and glory of Islam, security or defense of Pakistan, friendly relations with foreign states, public order, decency, morality, or in relations to contempt of court or incitement to offense. Now, these restrictions are very, very far-reaching, and you only require reasonable, with this thing, so whether it is banning of plays, and then because of these constitutional amendments, you have laws that are all made according to this. So whether it is a Pembra law, they will include that. Whether it is any other law, they will all include these restrictions, which are constitutional restrictions. And based on those, then there are regulations which are made, which again are based on that. And on top of all that, then you have regulatory overreach at all levels. So you are faced with a cascading effect that impacts freedom of expression. And this is nothing new. This has been happening. The safety or the strength that was there was in professional solidarity. That whenever any action used to be taken, the media would speak with one voice and they would oppose with one voice. And then the project, I think maybe 5-7 years ago, was started to weaken and to shatter this solidarity. And so different groups were formed. Each media outlet is happy when an action is taken against the other media outlet. The representative organizations are dagger drawn. CPNE opposes APNS, APNS opposes CPNE. PFUJ has been split into various groups, but I must say, despite that, it still remains the strongest voice for freedom of expression. And I would say perhaps the only voice for freedom of expression. And this is the reason why now, if a person is under threat, he stands alone. There isn't that professional solidarity that would make a lot of hue and cry, and then the government would be forced to back down. You know, and so this is the situation. The second thing which Asad and Sadaf also point is the polarization. The media suffered greatly when there was a first wave of this polarization of the left in the 60s and the 70s all around the globe, and now of the right all across the globe. But this wave which is there is, and in each cases, independent media felt space shrinking for it. But in this wave, which is there with charismatic leadership, it doesn't matter if right and wrong does not matter. If they are by the party you support, you will support them, whether they pick up a journalist, and then that journalist, the trolls will start, the media cells will start going after them. So the situation, the qualitative change which has happened over the past few years, and that has taken gaining speed, is the loss of professional solidarity at the individual level, at the company level, at the representative state level. So everybody is left on their own to fend for it. And so therefore you see a much greater level of censorship. You see a much more tamer discussion and debates on all issues. And you see government and political groups getting away with things they would never get away with a few years ago.
Thank you so much, sir. I think that's a brilliant summary and overview of how things have developed over the past few years. Thank you so much for that. As we come to the end of our time, we have one question from our audience, and I'll put that to both Sadaf and Fariha, if you may address it. And that's about independent journalists in Pakistan, whether they have more freedom or more safety from traditional risks and threats. While posing this question, I'll also add that हमारी research के अंदर, हमारी report के अंदर, the overwhelming sort of consensus was that we don't have many independent news organizations in Pakistan anymore, those who can exercise independence over their editorial policies. What is your take on this? Do you feel कि वो सहाफ़ी जो independent न्यूज़ इदारों के लिए काम कर रहे हैं ज़्यादा बेहतर protected हैं, या जैसे अब online बहुत सारे सहाफ़ियों ने publish करना शुरू कर दिया है, do you see them as independent but also at the same time as more vulnerable? Fariha, if you may please go ahead.
Because आपकी editorial independence तो हो सकती है ज़्यादा, and ज़ाहिर है कि that is a plus point. But जहाँ तक risk की बात है, and that the problem with the cybercrime law is then you are sort of on your own to bear those consequences when there's a summon by the FIA or and actually we've also seen that journalists affiliated with news organizations and news organizations have not stood by them. That's another thing, and what Avesa was pointing out also, right? That the kind of solidarity that exists. But certainly as an individual versus somebody who's embedded in an organization, and in some cases we do see that if it happens from, let's say, an organizational platform, or if it's on social media, at least you have some colleagues, there's that instant support, or maybe some access to legal counsel and otherwise, although this is not happening a whole lot, and people, even those within organizations, are looking to individuals who will help them out and bail them out when these things happen, because the organizations instantly, they also terminate them, or they force them into resignation. So, but as an individual, there's always, the risk is more.
Thank you, Fariha. Sadaf, if you would like to add something to this.
No, yeah, I agree with Faria that independence, I think, comes with its own cost, and you might be free to say what you want to, but then you're also in the limelight, specifically if you are somebody who does have a good reach, who does have an impact per se on the narratives, you would stand to receive threats, etc. And I also agree with what Faria was saying regarding legal support for people who are working with large organizations. I'd give you an example. Last year, earlier this year, in fact, no, last year, when Ali Zafar went on that defamation spree, a number of journalists who are associated with multiple media houses were given these defamation notices, and their organizations did not stand by them, and their legal support did not come from the organizations. So I think right now it's it's bad for everyone, but the only thing that people who are associated with organizations may have is a sense of community, because even if organizations themselves don't offer that kind of legal support or moral support or any kind of support, their peers still might be more closely connected to them, so they might speak in support. So you get that kind of a support group. I don't think it goes very far in actually saving you from a legal mess if you have landed into that, or saving you from actual threats if you have landed into that. For that, both people who are involved with media houses and people who are independently working with media houses or associated with smaller independent media houses, I think they do look to civil society organizations, they do look to the PFUJ, they do look to the union, essentially units operating outside the industry itself, who to offer whatever limited support they can. So yeah, I think it's pretty dismal for both kind of journalists.
Thank you so much, Sadaf. I'd like to thank all of you, Sadaf, Fariha, Vaisab, for taking the time out for today's panel discussion. It's really appreciated, and thank you so much for your valuable insight. At this point, I'll request Jaleel Babar Saab from CPDI to please offer the concluding remarks to wrap up this webinar.
Thank you, Akash. On behalf of CPDI and the Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression project partners, I thank you all for joining us today for the launch of this report and the excellent panel discussion that we have heard. We hope that the Pakistan Freedom of Expression report will become an important document for the identification of the threats and challenges faced by the citizen, and particularly by the journalists and human rights defenders in the exercise of their right to free speech. We also hope that the report will provide an opportunity to revisit and review the state of freedom of expression in Pakistan in the subsequent years. We plan to continue to work on the recommendations presented in the report so that citizens might better enjoy their rights and protection to free speech and protection provided to them under the Constitution. Thank you once again for your time, and we look forward to interacting you again in connection with the activities envisioned under the Civil Society for Independent Media and Expression project. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Judicial. Thank you so much for that. And once again, thank you to our panelists and our attendees who tuned in to watch today's webinar. Once again, the report is available on our website. I've shared the link here, and we will continue to share the report and its findings on our social media as well. Thank you so much for taking the time out. Please take care. Khuda Hafiz. Goodbye.
Hafiz, everyone.